All right, hello everybody. It is I, your garden coordinator, Andreas. It is just me today. That's why I am not wearing a mask, because we are now allowed to do that if we were outside. We wear masks in the garden anyways when everybody's here, when the student assistant and the interns are here, just for safety precautions. But today it's just me, and we'll be talking about composting, so stay tuned for that. But we are going to begin by doing a quick little garden tour and an update on the native planting from last week. So let's see how that's establishing. And I also wanted to show you all what we have done in the front bed where we are growing the beans. So we actually have gotten a harvest out of beans out of this front bed now, which is really exciting. Beans are typically thought of as a warm season crop, but here we are in the middle of fall getting a harvest, so that's pretty cool. We've had decently warm weather, so they've been doing well. We are having a couple issues with an iron deficiency, but that's not that big of a deal. That's something we'll be able to correct, so not a huge issue. And in addition to that, we got some new plants in yesterday. So we have some celery seedlings that we germinated starting in September. Some broccoli seedlings that were donated to us, and in between the celery and broccoli we sowed some beets. So this is a great example of companion planting principles in action. That is, 1, diversity. Select plants that are from different families. So here we have the cabbage family, Brassicaceae. Here we have the carrot family, Apiaceae, and in between we have the beet family, which I think is the amaranth family. I don't recall what family the beets are in, but they're all from different plant families, so they are going to require a different nutrient profile. Therefore, there will be less competition. Also, these plants have different growth forms, both above ground and below ground. So that will reduce competition as well between the plants and allow them to cooperate rather than compete. Now, when it comes to the beans are going to be leaving the system soon. And when that happens, we're going to chop and drop them and add the residues back to these mulch rows. And that's going to act as a source of natural fertilizer as it breaks down, a source of nitrogen, which will boost the growth of all of the plants in these rows. So this is a great way to manage your companion plantings, is, as soon as something comes out, put something else in. And not only that, pair shorter-lived crops with longer-lived crops. The beets are going to be out in 55 to 60 days, whereas the broccoli and the celery are going to take 90 days or more. So by the time the broccoli and celery begin to get quite large, it'll be time for the beets to come out. And by harvesting the beets, we are going to create space for the broccoli and celery. So that's an update on the companion planting system that we have going on here in the front bed. I wanted to show you all the new native plant area that we are establishing. So looking good. The transplants that we planted in are for the most part taking their time. They're not really growing too much. They're more focusing on putting on new root growth and sinking their roots deep down into the soil to access subsurface water reserves, because that's what native plants do. That's why they are so drought tolerant, because their root systems go way deep down into the soil to access water that many other plants can't reach. So they're working on doing that right now, with the exception of black sage. The black sage is pretty much already taking off. As soon as we got it in there, it's been taking off ever since, and I think that the black sage is going to do very well here. Black sage is a very common native plant in our area, and it is one of the best adapted native plants to our area. So it's going to do absolutely fantastic. I have very high hopes for that plant. And in addition, we can see that a lot of our native grassland species are coming up. We have a lot of wildflowers. I can see that the scarification of the lupine seeds was successful, because that is a lupine seedling right there. So treat your seeds, everybody. And we did this one with sandpaper. I would expect higher germination rates from them, because we did sow a lot of seeds. So maybe try a different treatment instead of sandpaper, possibly hot water treatment, possibly fire treatment. But the sandpaper treatment did have some measure of success. And we should probably begin to see more of them germinating, because typically when it comes to native wildflower and grass seeds, you tend to get staggered germination. A couple other ones that I recognize in here. Let's see now. I just started to see some of our native grasses today. So you can see them right there. That is either one of the stipas or the June grass. I hope we get good germination on our grasses because the flowers, the wildflowers and our native pioneer plants will do a lot better with these grasses. But it looks like we're going to be getting good germination overall. So another thing that we did was we spread birdseed around the area, not in the area, but around the area, because whenever you direct sow any kind of seeds on the surface, and this is recommended for native plants, just scattering them on the surface and not really incorporating them. And we lightly incorporated them so that some were on the surface and some were below ground. This helps to establish a seed bank. However, the ones that are above ground are prime targets for birds. So what we did was we threw down all of this bird seed in the area to distract the birds away from the native seeds. That way they wouldn't eat all of the seeds and our native seeds wouldn't become really expensive bird food, because native wildflower and grass seeds can be quite expensive. A pound of those grass seeds costs $70 and a pound of those wildflower seeds costs about $140. So they're not cheap. So it's good to use strategies like this to keep the birds distracted and off of your native seeds. Anyways, as far as some of the shrubs and perennials go that we direct sowed, it looks like the gum plant is germinating successfully, which is very exciting. I'm really excited about this plant, Grindelia camporum, Great Valley gum plant, because it's a fantastic pollinator plant that blooms late in the season. So this will attract a lot of your bees, a lot of your other beneficial insects that eat pests. And it's not just native. It actually is beneficial. A lot of these plants are. And the milkweeds look fantastic, and the elderberry looks fantastic as well. I'm not sure what these are. I don't think those are the monkey flowers. No signs of life on them yet. And we definitely don't have any of the deerweed or thistle coming up. These look like stragglers from the wildflower mix in here. So no deerweed and thistle yet. I did treat the deerweed seeds, and I did not treat the thistle seeds, the native cobweb thistle. So I would say, maybe let's give it a little bit more time. And, if we don't get germination within a week or two, maybe 3 weeks, I'd give it until, towards the end of the month. Then I'm going to try again and try and get these plants established again. Maybe try a different method of treating them. Maybe this time we'll do a fire treatment. We'll see about that one. That's not something I can do here, but I do have a space where I can do that off campus. And then I'll just bring them back to campus. So we'll see. But it looks like everything else is establishing, so that's really exciting. And you can see how easy establishing a native plant garden is. As long as you're working with a clean slate, with totally clean soil that does not have weed seeds, it's very easy to establish one of these native microprairies. And again, a native microprairie will pair very well with native shrubs, because as the native shrubs grow up, the microprairie species will support them by fixing nitrogen, by conditioning the soil, by attracting the ecosystem of pollinators, predators, and other insects that are critical for the health of these native shrubs. By the time these native shrubs grow up and start to become senescent and need to be pruned, we can prune them, and then we have a seed bank of our native grassland seeds in the soil. And as soon as we do that, they can begin to reseed and reestablish. We create the conditions for the reestablishment by pruning, i.e. managing the system. So there's our native planting. We did plant a couple more native plants, actually. So I wanted to show you guys where we did that and talk about the ones that we did. So right here, we just sowed these yesterday. In this exact spot, we have bladderpod, Paratoma arborea. Bladderpod is a very interesting and unique native plant that is in the caper family, Cleomaceae. And apparently you can actually use bladderpod just like capers. And the seed pods are edible and the flowers are edible after some processing. A lot of native plants you have to process before eating them. But really interesting plant, great for pollinators, grows very fast, so we may be able to use this plant as a mulch producer as well. Another one that we planted is over here, and this is a more moisture-loving native that you'll find in washes, drainage areas, near bodies of water. We planted this one right here. It is called mule fat. Scammer, sorry, trying to call me right now. I get those robocalls all the time. Mule fat, Baccharis salicifolia. So again, this is a plant that grows very close to streams, and it's a very important pollinator plant. It is especially important for monarch butterflies who use it as a source of nectar. So we have the food for the young monarch butterflies over there, the caterpillars. That would be our native narrowleaf milkweed, Asclepias fascicularis, and we have a lot of other plants that the adult monarch butterflies need in order to feed upon. So slowly integrating native plants more into this garden, which is something that should be done in every garden, you know, both for habitat value for wildlife, both because we're losing our native ecosystems at a very rapid and astounding rate, and a lot of these plants may go extinct within the next few years in the wild, so we should plant them to conserve their genetics, and because these plants can actually benefit our garden. They can provide habitat for the good guys that defend our vegetable crops from pests. So, great thing to do. Plant native plants. Anyways, let's move on to composting, the main subject of this video. I am just going to set the camera up over here in front of our hot compost system. So, hot composting. This is our compost tumbler, all right? And this is a pretty easy way to produce hot compost. So there are two main types of compost, and I'm going to get in front of the camera here. So here we go. We have hot compost and we have cold compost. And this refers to the process that was used to produce the compost. So hot compost employs bacteria, which have very rapid metabolisms and which reproduce and consume organic material very quickly. So every single metabolic process in the world of life, you know, because every living thing has a metabolism, produces heat as a byproduct. Therefore, the more rapid the metabolism of the organisms in your compost pile, the hotter the pile is going to get. It's going to produce waste heat. And we can utilize this waste heat in a composting system to further accelerate the process and also destroy weed seeds and pathogens to prevent them from spreading to our vegetable crops, to other crops and around our garden when we use this compost. And this hot compost tends to be quite good for vegetables, you know, especially some of the more weedy vegetables like arugula and radishes, and maybe peas, that kind of stuff. Stuff that is really easy to grow, thrives in poor soils. They'll definitely love hot compost. And you know, all of your vegetables will in general. Tomatoes is another example. All of your vegetables will like hot compost, pretty much. But we also have cold composting. And so cold composting relies on a cold process that occurs at ambient temperatures. So we don't do anything to increase the speed and temperature of the composting reaction. We just leave it be and allow the process to progress at a slower rate. And what this does is it creates opportunity for more organisms to proliferate in the compost pile and break down that organic matter. For example, fungi, for example, soil mesofauna, that is like, you know, you'll find some of those in a hot compost pile too, but smaller organisms, you know, just sort of like small invertebrates, you know, that kind of stuff. And then the macrofauna, which is like our worms, our roly-polies, our centipedes, you know, the bigger stuff will do better in a cold compost pile. And at the end of the day, this is not going to kill diseases and weed seeds, but it could create a higher quality product, especially for perennial plants and fruit trees. All right, so in hot composting, what do we do in order to speed the process up, in order to get the pile to go hot, in order to encourage the rapid metabolism of these bacteria that break down the waste, in order to encourage them to consume the waste and reproduce rapidly? Well, composting is an aerobic process. That means it requires oxygen. It also requires food and fuel. So our food is our brown material. For example, these autumn leaves that I brought today that I collected from my yard. You can see they are brown. And many brown materials are brown. But all that means is that these materials, relatively speaking, are very high in carbon relative to the amount of nitrogen in them. Because nitrogen is our fuel. We find lots of nitrogen in materials such as these, food scraps. Food scraps are very high in nitrogen because they contain protein. This is where nitrogen is typically found in biological systems, in proteins, and in amino acids. So you'll find a lot of those things in fruit, in vegetables, that kind of stuff, and other materials that are very high in protein normally. So we have our food and our fuel, and so carbon is a food source. Carbon is the basis of all life. And, therefore, every single organism in compost needs to be able to consume carbon-based material and incorporate it into its tissues. So, nitrogen is used to build amino acids, which is then used to build proteins and enzymes. All right? So, these proteins and enzymes are the actual molecular machines that drive these biochemical reactions, that fuel these biochemical reactions. So the more nitrogen you have available in your compost pile, the more rapidly the microbes in your compost can build and operate these molecular machines, which facilitate the breakdown of the organic matter you put in your compost pile and generate this waste heat. And also, composting is temperature dependent. The hotter the pile is up to a point, the more rapidly the process will progress, because a lot of these biomolecules that are present in our bacteria that break down the organic matter can operate more efficiently at higher temperatures. And this can allow us to produce a hot compost product in as little as 18 days. Usually hot composting takes between 18 days and 3 months. Cold composting will take 3 months or more, depending on the materials that you add. All right, so with hot composting, general rule: even amount of browns and even amount of greens by volume. And if we want the process to progress efficiently, there's one thing that we should do before we add the materials: chop them up. So I'm going to take questions real quick. If anybody has questions, I'm going to check the chat, and then I'm going to go get the loppers so that we can chop up this material. All right, here's another look at our material right here. Just a mix of food scraps, and then we have the leaves. You can also use wood chips, sawdust, twigs, all kinds of stuff. So we want to process these materials down now, so I'll be right back. All right, everybody, I have returned. So I also just tried to hook up the hose, but it appears that the water is off in the wellness garden right now. I'm not sure why. I'm gonna have to give PPM a call and see what's going on, but it's not that big of a deal. We're not gonna really need water right now, but I'll tell you guys what water is for in composting in a moment. Alright, just get this over here. So we are then going to chop up these leaves into little bits. So I like to use these gigantic pruning scissors, or loppers as they're oftentimes called. Do this. Makes it really easy. Just like that. You can also get a leaf mulcher, a leaf vacuum. If you're working with wood chips, you can get small electric wood chippers for roughly $200. So something you don't want in a compost, and this probably just made its way in there because I did collect these leaves from the green bin. You do not want plastic in compost because plastic does not decompose. It takes forever to decompose, 500 plus years. So this is going to look exactly the same after it goes through the composting process, and it's pollution, so we don't want this. So no plastic. Generally the rule is anything that is raw plant material that was produced by a plant and that is raw. So no cooked vegetables, no bread, no animal products, so no meat, no cheese, no dairy, none of that stuff. We're just concerned with plant material here. And leaves, so shredded up leaves like this are one of our most fantastic browns out there. And they're really good for a hot compost pile because they're not too brown. They're not like wood chips. Wood chips are about 4 to 4.5 times more brown than these dried leaves. And the browner something is, the tougher it is to decompose because there's less nitrogen available and the more greens are going to need in order to decompose it in a hot process. In a cold process, the more brown something is, just the longer it takes to break down. But the benefit of using very brown material is that you end up with a very fungal product, and it'll take longer to produce this fungal compost, but it's very, very good for fruit trees and perennials. So we're producing vegetable compost right now in this tumbler. Keep chopping this up nice and fine. And I like to use a leaf vacuum for this purpose. A device that doubles as a leaf blower and a vacuum that will suck up the leaves and shred them up into tiny little bits. And using a device like this will make it go a lot faster. The fastest of all is a leaf mulcher. But generally these devices only work with dried leaves, not fresh leaves that still have moisture in them. So we're gonna keep doing this. It's a pretty good workout. All right, and so what we're doing here by shredding this material into smaller pieces is we're increasing the surface area to volume ratio of the material. We're creating more surfaces on the material that the microbes in the compost can colonize and begin consuming. And this is going to increase the efficiency with which the material breaks down and the efficiency with which the compost pile operates. And it will produce a higher quality compost. When it comes to compost, quality is everything. If you don't have a good compost, you may as well not use it. It could actually hurt your plants. And how good your compost is really depends on how good your process is. And we can improve how good our process is by breaking down this material. So that's one way to do it. So when it comes to hot compost piles, the thing that you're going to want to do when they begin to heat up, because they will, is you want to turn them. As I said, composting is an aerobic process. And in order to incorporate oxygen back into the compost pile, because it will get used up as the pile begins to heat up, it'll begin to go anaerobic. Well, it could begin to go anaerobic if you don't turn it. And that's not what we want. You need to turn it. You need to mix it around. And this ensures even temperature, even heating, and even oxygenation. So, the one thing I haven't talked about with composting yet is water. So, water is also kind of like a fuel, because water is necessary to carry out all biochemical reactions. So if we don't have water, because composting is a biological process, then we can't make compost. And so a great way to store your materials, if you're just sort of collecting them in preparation for building a pile, is to just keep them dry. Just keep them in a dry location and they won't break down. Don't allow them to be moist. And they'll just pretty much stay as is. And make sure they're covered as well, especially your green material, because what can happen with your green material is if you leave them uncovered and exposed to the elements and sunlight is they can oxidize. They can actually lose their nitrogen. It can volatilize and escape into the atmosphere. And now they're brown materials, and I don't think that's what we want. We need green materials. So, almost done here with these leaves. And again, get a shredder of some kind to speed this process up. And you don't have to shred these materials. It's totally optional, but it'll produce a higher quality product. And it'll make it less likely that your pile goes anaerobic. Because if your pile goes anaerobic, what that means is that anaerobic bacteria will begin to proliferate. And what anaerobic bacteria do is they cause nutrients to become volatilized, that is, turn into a gas and escape into the atmosphere. And they cause, they create these toxic compounds that can actually injure and hurt and possibly even kill your plants. Here's some organism you'll find in the compost that helps break things down. Molds. Honestly, the mold that you find growing on a lot of your food scraps and like old food, it's all good stuff. For the most part, they're composting organisms. Oh, and another thing you don't want to do is have these labels. You want to take those off because those are plastic. Those aren't breaking down. So keep the labels off the food. And also, another thing is be careful about citrus rinds. You can add a little bit of citrus to a compost pile, I find, but adding a lot at once is a big no-no. And that's for two reasons. Well, three really. First of all, citrus can lower the pH of your compost pile. So your compost pile needs to have a pH balance. It needs to have a balanced pH in order for the microbes and fungi in your compost that break down the organic matter to remain healthy. And also, citric acid is a natural antimicrobial agent. And so in large quantities, citric acid can actually inhibit a lot of the microbes that carry out the composting process. And then also, as citrus breaks down, it tends to create unpleasant smells. And that one's, it's not really too harmful, but it's an issue nonetheless. Usually, when it comes to composting, in order to ascertain how well your composting process is progressing, use your nose. Your nose will tell you. If something smells bad in your compost, it probably is bad. It's probably anaerobic. But certain things just create smells as they break down. So onions, for example, too. Oh, wow. So check it out. On Monday, we had our Healthy Growers training, and we actually activated this compost pile. And we do that by adding water to it. And so check this out. We can already see these organisms. I just added this plate into there. This life beginning to proliferate. Check this out. Look at all those molds, that mycelium growing in there. That is the materials beginning to break down, and it doesn't smell bad. It actually smells kind of nice in here. But look at this. That fuzzy spider web stuff, that's a fungus that's consuming this material. So this process has already started. Look at this. Wow. Look at that. And it's already starting to get warm and heat up. It's already getting warm. So we're going to keep adding material. We're going to keep adding water. I'm going to actually rip this plate up really quick. Keep adding material, keep adding water until it gets full, and then we're going to allow it to break down. And we're going to turn it periodically. We don't want to let our compost pile get above 160 degrees. And for a while, we want to maintain it at 130 degrees to kill weed seeds and diseases. This is the temperature where a lot of these things will die. So we are going to add our leaves, and I'm going to reposition the camera here really quick, so bear with me. Let's add our leaves. It's hard to get the camera positioned correctly here. Let's add our leaves. Okay, so our shredded leaves, we're going to add these. So we'll do a little bit of shredded leaves. And leaves from your yard are great because you usually have lots of good biology growing on leaves. Lots of good fungi, lots of good bacteria, all this good stuff. So then we'll add our food scraps. And when I'm building a compost pile, I like to layer everything. I'm gonna get some gloves. Just want to mix it around. Like so. Mix it around. And we'll add more leaves. Add the rest of the leaves. And then now we just need some water. And I don't have water right now. I'm gonna need to call PPM and ask them to turn the water back on. We recently had a change of staff there, and maybe the new person changed the watering allowances for the garden, so I'm gonna need to correct that situation. Anyways, so there we go. Now we'll water that in, and then we'll turn it. And then if we're done building our pile, we're gonna leave it as is until it gets hot, and then we're gonna turn it. And we're gonna keep it moist, and we're gonna turn it to maintain even moisture and temperature throughout the pile. And as we do that, everything is gonna begin breaking down. Everything is gonna begin decomposing. And we're gonna end up with this wonderful, beautiful product that is brown, that is crumbly, looks like chocolate cake, and it's a fantastic soil amendment, fertilizer, and inoculant that it introduces beneficial biology to your garden all in one. As I like to say, compost is everything. Healthy soil in your garden starts with a proper composting regime. That's one of the things that it starts with. You need to be producing good compost with local biology, local microbes, local fungi, local mites, local nematodes, local arthropods, local insects, all those organisms, and you introduce those organisms to your soil, because these organisms make up a large part of our soil food web. The other component of healthy soil is living roots, and just proper management practices like minimizing disturbance and covering the soil and that kind of stuff. But composting is a major part of maintaining soil health, and it's also a great way to recycle your waste. It's very easy to do. You know, I know what I just went through sounds kind of complicated, but hot composting is sort of like, you know, a more labor-intensive way to do it, and it's something that you have to be on top of more. But there are other ways, and we're going to talk about those ways now. So, I want to talk about vermicomposting as well, but let's talk about cold composting first. So I'm going to bring you all over to our cold pile over here. And our cold pile is sort of just like a repository for like a lot of our woodier and tougher residues. We just put a lot of the stuff in here that's harder to run through a hot composting process, and we'll use this to produce, again, a more fungal compost that is good for like fruit trees and that kind of stuff. So here's our cold pile. It's just a bin like this, so we don't turn it at all. You know, we layer in our materials like lasagna, and if it gets hot when we start the pile, we do turn it, but normally we just add things, you know. And it works just fine. So we added some cardboard, we added some paper towels. These things are all okay to compost. I mean, bleached paper towels, I found a hit or miss. Some brands will break down and some will not. So this pile needs some water. Can't water it right now, but if we dig down there, we'll see that it's moist. And we'll see that we're making compost. That's some old garden soil that I added. You can add, I would not recommend like adding old soil to a hot compost pile, but to a cold compost pile you can. And so the material breaks down, and as it does, you know, the stuff on the bottom becomes more mature, you know, it becomes aged, and eventually we end up with this product. And I'll dig out a sample for you all right now. This beautiful product at the end of the day called compost. And cold composting is very easy. I pulled out a lot of this stuff, so it's hard to find it, but you can see, you know, this isn't sifted, but once we sift it, it'll be this beautiful crumbly material right there. Whoopsies. Right there. That is pretty well done cold compost, and this will take 3 months or more to make. 3 months to 2 years, I would say, depending on what you add. The higher carbon material you add, the longer it's going to take. And as you can see, it's nice and crumbly. You know, it just looks like good, healthy soil. And that's pretty much what it is. What we're doing right here is we're just producing topsoil in a controlled environment, in a container, you know? That's what composting really is at the end of the day. We're producing this topsoil material. You can talk about some ways to use compost in a bit. Let's check the time. Let's see, 10:35. We have plenty of time to talk about these things. Fantastic. Yep, that's cold composting. You just layer your materials in and you water it, and that's it. You know, you can just keep adding, and then in this bin you harvest it from the bottom with the shovel, with the rake, with the whatever tool you like to use to harvest it. Then you sift it out because, you know, typically in cold compost, you know, the tougher materials are gonna take longer to break down, and by the time everything else is done breaking down, you're not gonna, those will not be broken down. Like, for example, wood chips. Stuff that's very woody tends to be higher in carbon and it's much tougher. So wood chips are much tougher than leaves. Sawdust is much tougher than leaves. That kind of stuff. So that stuff is going to need, that material is going to need to be sifted out and then re-added back to the pile or to another pile to start the other pile, because material that is not fully decomposed will have a lot of our composting organisms on it, and we can sort of use that as like a mother, sort of like how you would have a sourdough mother or a kombucha mother. You know, we can add that mother to a new compost pile to introduce the biology, to start it, just sprinkle it and mix it throughout. So yeah, that's called composting. And the other method I wanted to talk about is called vermicomposting or worm composting. And this is probably the easiest method to do of all. You know, people tend to be intimidated by worm farms, but don't be intimidated by worm farms. They are so incredibly easy to maintain. So incredibly easy. Like, I barely touch my worm farm. Like, the most that I do is feed the worms and harvest the end product, which is sort of like, it's a cold compost that has, you know, a lot of the beneficial qualities of hot compost, which is super cool. So a lot of your pathogens will be dealt with in a worm farm that won't be dealt with in a cold compost pile, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to just position this and take out the worm farm. Let's put it on the table here, actually, so that I can show you all. I want to clear this material out really quickly. All right. So let's bring the worm farm on the table. Okay, here's our worm farm, and I believe, I want to say we got this one from like, it's always been here, but it looks like the kind that's given out by LA Compost. So if you want to get into composting, check out the non-profit organization LA Compost. They're a fantastic bunch of people. Anyways, here's our worm farm, and you know, it works a lot like a cold compost pile, except it's a self-contained, it's a much more self-contained system. And so what we'll do is we'll add this bedding material, and in this case, you know, we just used some spent seed starting mix. That worked just fine, and the worms are breaking it down. We don't have a lot of worms in here right now, but they are here. You'll be able to see them, and we introduced them. Yep, here we go. We introduced these worms, and we actually just took a bunch of worms out. That's why we don't have many. We introduced them into one of our hydroponic systems. But you can see we've got these worms right here. They're not very happy about being taken out of their home, so let's put them back. But these are worms that you could buy online. You can buy at pretty much any garden center or nursery that is, you know, good, that has a wide selection of products. I wouldn't expect to find worms at every single hardware store, but if you go to like Green Thumb, Armstrong, places like that, you'll definitely find worms, and they're not cheap. You know, it costs like $35 to $40 per pound of worms, but as long as you maintain your worm farm, 1 pound is all you're gonna need. So to start a worm farm, you know, you add your bedding material. You'll probably introduce a small amount of food scraps because the worms are still getting adapted to the new environment. They haven't built up their populations yet, so add a small amount. Like when I started my worm farm, I added one banana peel, and left it there for 2 weeks, and then I just started gradually increasing the amount of food scraps that I added until the worm farm really got going. And then you could add food scraps continuously. Pretty much just like any compost pile, you want an even ratio of greens to browns, and since you have a smaller mass of material in here, you don't have all this material, it's not going to really heat up that much, and so therefore the worms will be able to stay in here and consume it, and it remains a cold process. And the worms will also clean out this material as it passes through their digestive tract and inoculated it with all kinds of beneficial microbes that live in their guts. So it's a fantastic process that produces this fantastic product, and it's so great that you can even do it indoors. And here's the end product right here. This is a 3-tier worm farm where the end product will actually fall through the holes, and then we have these beautiful worm castings right here. Beautiful worm castings. You can see how they look nice and crumbly. They're well aggregated, as us soil nerds will say. And so what I could actually do with this is I could sprinkle this in the hot compost pile as a mother, So I'm going to do that with this material right here. So this will help the hot compost pile really get going, because it contains those worms and all those microbes. And the worms will probably leave the pile as it heats up, but a lot of the microbes that are that they introduce and that they bring over will stay, and those will help compost our food scraps and our other material that we added. So those are worm castings. They make a great fertilizer, a weak fertilizer. Worm castings are a weak fertilizer, and compost is an even weaker fertilizer, but you'll add it in large amounts, so it's hard to over apply because it's so weak. But yeah, this is the end material. And the thing about worm farms is if you manage them properly, they don't smell. And since you can do it in such a small space, you can do them in a 5-gallon bucket like the ones I showed you earlier. You can do them inside. You can do them under your kitchen sink. You know, this is the easiest way to compost for anybody who's living in a small space. And when it comes to hot composting, you need to make sure you have a decently sized pile, because you need to have all that mass in order to get it to heat up to the level you want it to. Normally you need, like, to be really serious about it, you need about a cubic yard of material. You can't really produce true hot compost in one of those tumblers. It'll be sort of like a worm compost, and it won't have all the benefits of hot compost. But this method has a lot of the benefits of hot composting. You know, it's more rapid than cold composting, way more rapid. A lot of our diseases will get cleaned out as they pass through the guts of the worms. And it produces this very high quality, balanced product that is fantastic for your plants. Yeah, so that's worm compost. So I want to talk about some of our ways to use compost then. And in fact, I would like to add a lot of this worm compost to this new bed that we just turned over on Monday with the new interns who are taking the Healthy Growers training, which again will be made available to the public at some point. Definitely stay tuned for that. It's a comprehensive vegetable gardening training, organic vegetable gardening training. Very comprehensive. So this is our new bed that we just reset. And I've always talked about soil coverage before, but don't fret, you know, even though the soil looks like it's not covered, we sowed this in with cover crops, so it will be covered quite well in a couple weeks. What we could do here is we could just sprinkle this in, you know, just sprinkle in those worm castings, introduce those worms, introduce that biology, that little bit of extra nutrients in there. It'll get watered in, and it'll do great. So, yeah, that's a great way to fertilize your soil. You know, worm castings are pretty nutrient rich, relatively speaking. It's not going to be as rich as a store-bought fertilizer, but you know, you can produce it for free from your food scraps, from your waste. So composting is super sustainable because it's a great way to reuse your waste. And I found that, like, as I've started composting, pretty much, I have felt the need to use plastic less, because I know, oh my god, you know, I realize that this material is going to essentially cause pollution. So I'd rather use something that I could put in my composting system and like create into something I could reuse in my garden to grow food, you know, and to improve the health of my soil. So composting is great for that reason. It'll encourage you to reduce your waste footprint. Really like it for that reason as well. So another way we can use compost is by producing compost teas and extracts. So the one thing that I mentioned about compost is that not only can it be used as a soil amendment, not only is it a weak fertilizer, but it also contains a diverse cross-section of our soil food web organisms. And a lot of these organisms can actually be propagated in water. So what I'm going to do, this bucket right here that just has leaves in it, I'm going to fill it up with water. So I'm going to fill this up with water from the aquaponics system. I'm going to fill it up, and while we're doing that, we're going to collect some worm castings and get a paint strainer. And I'll show you guys how to make actively aerated compost tea, which is a product that you can create in your garden. It's a concoction where you grow out, you actually propagate a lot of these beneficial microbes that are found in compost, and then you can apply them to your soil and to your plants in a liquid form, and to your seeds too. You can use it to treat seeds. It's great to treat seeds because you want to have all that biology. Soil is a living thing. You want to have life in your soil, and this is a great way to propagate some of that life. So I need to find a paint strainer. I know I brought one here. I'm just not sure what I did with it, so please bear with me. Ah, there it is. Paint strainer. So this is one of the things that you'll need, aside from a 5-gallon bucket to make compost tea, is a paint strainer. And I prefer to make it with worm castings, because I know that worm castings are probably going to be cleaner than whatever compost I'm making, you know, unless I have a really good hot process. So we're going to just set this right here and wait for the bucket to fill up. And again, compost tea is a great way to introduce these beneficial microbes to your soil from your compost and apply them more evenly and in a liquid form. And it allows you to essentially stretch out the compost as you're using it, which is great, you know? So I'm going to produce this compost tea, and I'll show you the process because there are a couple other ingredients we need to add. And check on this water. It's almost full. So any questions, please feel free to just drop them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them about composting or any other gardening subject. And just a reminder, you can use the Ask a Master Gardener feature on our website. Just go to the link and fill out the form. And then we will get back to you with answers to any questions you may have about your garden. All right, this is cold. So I have talked about aquaponics in the past, and aquaponic water is actually great for use in a compost tea. It's a fantastic carrier solution for compost tea because it is very rich in nutrients. So I'm going to bring this over here. Because we have our air pump over here. Oh, the camera. This tripod tends to like to be loose. Just bear with me for one moment, please. So, I'm going to reposition the camera for you all and just tighten it up. So here we have our aquaponic water, and I'm probably going to want to skim off some of those leaves. And you could just use regular tap water for this as long as it's dechlorinated. And compost tea is a fantastic thing to use if you are first starting your garden, especially. If you already have healthy soil, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it also is great as a foliar spray to apply to the leaves of your plants to essentially coat them with this beneficial biology that will help protect them. All right, so let me go ahead and get some of that worm compost. So about 2 handfuls is good, I would say. 1 to 2 handfuls. This is probably more than you need because we're interested in propagating the biology, and you know what microbes are very good at doing is multiplying. So we're just going to stick this in here, just like so. And we're going to take one of these air stones from the hydroponics seed starting table, and we're just going to place it in here because again, a lot of these microbes that proliferate in compost are aerobic organisms. They require an oxygen-rich environment in order to live. So we want to give them an oxygen-rich environment by adding this air stone that will introduce air bubbles, that is oxygen from the atmosphere, and constantly turn and mix the water. So, a couple more things we got to add. So we have our worm compost. Bear with me for one moment, please. And so we're also going to use fish and seaweed fertilizer and unsulfured blackstrap molasses. So I'll explain what these do in a moment. I'm going to get one more thing. A 2 teaspoon or 1/8 of a cup measuring spoon, because this is how much of each we're going to want to add. So, what we're doing here, this is fertilizer, so it contains nutrients. We're adding a small amount of nutrients to the broom to feed the microbes. So remember, This is our fuel. This contains nitrogen. Molasses is very rich in sugars. And what do sugars contain a lot of? Carbon. So this is our carbon and nitrogen. Same for the composting process. Instead we're doing this in water. We're giving the microbes this food in an aqueous solution. So what we're going to do, and this is a very simple compost tea recipe. There are many recipes. So we're just going to massage this a little bit. Make sure some of those finer solids are nice and incorporated in the water. I want to make sure this air stone is more in the center, if it'll stay there. This is very aggressive bubbling, so it may not. Yeah, it won't. It's okay. As long as the water's being turned over, you're fine. And yeah, we are going to end this live soon. There's not much more to talk about after this. Except maybe how to apply compost, and a couple more ways to do it. So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of fish and seaweed fertilizer. All right, like so. There we are. And 2 tablespoons of our unsulfured blackstrap molasses. All right, there we are. Just we want to get all the rest of that off. Let's go ahead and mix it in. Some people say not to use molasses, some people say do. You know, I'd say do some experimentation. Look up some recipes, develop your own, whatever works, you know. Whatever works for your garden is what's best. All right, so there's only one thing left to do now. And cover it up. So we want to protect it from the elements, protect it from the sun, and we want this process to progress at room temperature as well. Not ambient temperature, sorry. Not room temperature. The ambient outside temperature. This will not fit. Let me find something to cover that up with. I'll be right back. All right, Eureka, I found it. Bucket lid right here. Perfect, ain't it? So we're gonna cover it up. We want this to be secure, but open to the atmosphere so that the air can get in. Just like so, just lightly cover it. If it's windy outside, or if you have animals that might try and get in, just weigh it down with a rock. And now, we're going to leave this for 24 to 48 hours to give the opportunity for the microbes to consume the food and reproduce. And then we can apply this as a soil drench, as a foliar spray, or a seed treatment. And what these microbes do is they're going to increase the health of your soil, your plants, and your seedlings. Now, there's one very important thing to mention. This is why I like to use worm casting for this process. You want to use a high quality compost product. You do not want to use a compost that was improperly made. You do not want to use a compost that has gone anaerobic. You do not want to use a compost that just in general does not have a high diversity of these microbes, or not a lot of good microbes. You do not want to use a compost that contains diseases. So, because then you'll be spraying diseases onto your soil and plants. You don't want that, so make sure you have a good product. And that's why I like to use worm castings. You know, properly made worm castings are pretty much guaranteed to be good products, and they'll make a good compost tea. And whenever I spray compost tea as a foliar spray, I will see the plants perk up within a day. And they love it. So great for your soil too. So we're going to be applying this at the soil here, and you know, a little bit goes a long way. I like to apply this in this little foliar sprayer right here. This thing, you can get one of these online. You just screw it in. Has a couple different settings. You just fill this up with your compost tea. Make sure that it's screened, because you don't want this to get clogged. That's what the paint strainer is for, so that all the larger solids don't get in the water and clog your applicator up. But just spray it. You know, spray it on the surface of your soil. spray it on the leaves, underside of the leaves especially, water it in the watering can, whatever, just apply it. Really easy to do. And it's a great way to introduce more beneficial soil microbes to your garden. Compost tea will mostly proliferate a lot of our bacteria and maybe some of our single-celled fungi such as yeast. So don't expect to proliferate like some of our more complex multicellular mycelial fungi in here. Not really a thing in compost tea as much, but a lot of our smaller organisms will reproduce really well in here. And a lot of these smaller organisms are critical for establishing healthy soil and healthy soil food web at the earlier stages of the garden. Compost tea is something that I started using a lot initially in my garden, and when we started transitioning our practices here in the wellness garden over to more regenerative soil and health and living soil practices. And we have gotten amazing results from that, as you all have seen. All of our plants look pretty much healthier than they've ever been, at least since I've been here. So yeah, that's how you make compost tea. We're going to leave this 24 to 48 hours, and we're going to use it. If you wait too long, it will spoil and it'll be useless. So don't wait. Use it when it is done. And if it starts to smell funky, if it starts to look funky, then don't use it. It's probably gone bad. And this, like composting, is a temperature dependent process. So the warmer it is, the quicker it's going to be. So just keep that in mind. If we're in the middle of summer, it might only take a day. In the winter, it could take more than 48 hours, maybe 72. And you want to do it at ambient temperature because all these microbes in your compost are used to being exposed to ambient temperature, because this is the finished product, that contains the mature microbiome of the compost. And that mature microbiome is adapted to the ambient temperature of your environment. If you do it outside of the temperature range of your environment, you could actually proliferate some of the bad organisms. And this is something that happened one time. Heard a story from, I think it was Dr. Lane Ingham about how they were producing compost tea at room temperature at this one facility. It was actually hurting their plants. So the process and the quality of the starting material are both super important. All right. So yeah, I'll talk briefly about some other composting systems, and then we're going to end the live. Actually, we only have 2 minutes left now, so that's probably going to be it. But a couple things you want to check out, I would say, are bokashi composting, which is an anaerobic fermentation process that you can use to deal with a lot of the no-nos. I didn't really talk about it. I did talk about the no-nos. So, like, you can use bokashi to deal with meats, with junk food, with bread, any kind of food scrap that isn't normally considered compostable can be dealt with using bokashi. And then also, I like to use this method called the Johnson-Su method, which is a no-turn composting system that uses air tubes in a bin that is open to the atmosphere, that is porous. And you just layer everything in there like lasagna, water it, and then let it go. And you don't turn it at all. And that's a great process. It produces some of the highest quality compost you could possibly produce. So really love the Johnson-Su method, so check that out as well. May need a bit of a bigger space to get the most out of it, but you can do it in a small space, and that's what I do at home. I have a couple of small Johnson-Su style bins that I use. That's my composting system, as opposed to one of those tumblers. Again, I don't like the tumblers too much, but they're very convenient, very easy to use. That's what's great about them. If you want to be a lazy composter and make hot compost in a more lazy manner, use a tumbler. Just make sure you're doing it right. Anyways, that's going to conclude this week's live. Any questions? No questions. We did plant some more things in the hydroponic system. Minatina, Wild Rocket, the Mugwort is doing fantastic. We're going to talk about hydroponics and aquaponics again soon, don't worry. So stay tuned for that. And next time, stay tuned for seed starting. We're going to do that one again because that is a topic that a lot of new gardeners struggle with, and we want to cover that and make sure everybody has a chance to understand how to do that properly. All right, thank you everybody for joining us on today's Live in the Wellness Garden. I will see you all next week at 10 o'clock a.m. Have a good week.